John Harrington, a wealthy man in his early 60s, sat alone in his sleek black BMW, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The late afternoon Georgia heat was relentless, and the car's air conditioning struggled to keep him comfortable. A retired executive with decades of success in the tech industry, John was accustomed to things running smoothly. But on this particular day, his plans were derailed by a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. After multiple failed attempts to get through to roadside assistance, John sighed in frustration and resigned himself to waiting. As he leaned back in his seat, contemplating the long stretch of empty road ahead, a figure emerged in the distance. It was a teenage boy, maybe 14 or 15, wearing a worn-out Braves baseball cap, a tattered t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers. The boy walked with purpose, his eyes fixed on John's car. As he approached, John rolled down his window. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady and polite. "Yes, unfortunately," John replied with a mix of relief and hesitation. "I was hoping to get some help, but my phone isn't working out here." The boy smiled confidently. "I can help you with that. My dad taught me how to change a tire last year." "Got a spare?" John gestured to the trunk, watching as the boy immediately got to work. He opened the trunk, pulled out the tools, and knelt down by the tire. John couldn't help but marvel at the boy's quiet competence. There was a focus in his movements that seemed far beyond his years. As the boy worked, John stood by, feeling strangely humbled. It had been years since anyone had offered him help without expecting something in return. He reached into his wallet, preparing to offer the boy some cash once the job was done. A few minutes later, the boy wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back. "All set," he said with a satisfied smile. John extended a few bills toward the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help." But the boy stepped back, raising his hand politely. "No, thank you, sir. I'm just happy to help." Stunned, John stood there with the money still in his hand, watching as the boy turned and walked away down the road. His faded t-shirt and worn-out sneakers were a stark contrast to John's designer suit and luxury car. But the boy carried himself with a quiet dignity that lingered long after he disappeared into the distance. That evening, back in the silence of his sprawling estate, John couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. The boy's confident smile and humble refusal replayed in his mind. For decades, John had worked in a world where every interaction came with an expectation, an exchange of favors, money, or influence. This boy, however, had done something remarkable without asking for anything in return. John sipped his bourbon and leaned back in his leather armchair, the ticking of the grandfather clock echoing in the quiet room. He felt a twinge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time, gratitude, and a newfound curiosity about the boy who had reminded him of the simple power of kindness. John Harrington, a retired entrepreneur in his early 60s, sat in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. The quiet of his spacious, modern home was interrupted only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. His dinner, an expertly prepared filet mignon with asparagus, sat untouched on the table beside him. His mind was elsewhere, replaying an encounter from the previous day that had left a mark on him. A boy, no more than 14, had helped him change a flat tire on a desolate road in rural Georgia. There had been no hesitation, no questions asked, just kindness, offered freely. John had spent a lifetime building businesses, managing teams, and making deals where every interaction involved a transaction or expectation. But this boy, with his dusty clothes and calm demeanor, had asked for nothing in return. John swirled the bourbon in his glass, his mind fixated on the boy's confident smile and simple words, "If someone needs help and I can do it, why wouldn't I?" The next morning, John felt compelled to find the boy. He couldn't quite explain why, but something about the encounter felt unfinished. Maybe it was gratitude, or maybe it was the way the boy had reminded him of a version of himself he had long forgotten. John set off in his car, retracing his route from the previous day. He stopped at diners and gas stations, describing the boy to anyone who would listen. Most shook their heads or offered polite shrugs. But finally, an older woman at a small cafe wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Sounds like you're talking about Samuel. That boy's always helping folks. Lives with his mama over in Madison." John nodded, making a mental note of the town. "Thank you," he said, feeling a spark of hope. The drive to Madison took just over an hour. The small town sat nestled in the rolling hills of Georgia, its streets lined with modest homes and aging storefronts. When John arrived, he asked around until a local pointed him toward a small, weathered house on the edge of town. The house wasn't much, its porch sagged slightly, and the paint had begun to peel, but it had an air of quiet resilience. John parked his car and hesitated for a moment before walking up to knock on the door. A woman in her early 40s answered. She looked tired but kind, her eyes sharp with curiosity as she sized him up. "Can I help you?" she asked. John cleared his throat. "Good morning. I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday, Samuel. Right? He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened, and a small smile appeared. "That sounds like my Samuel. He's always helping folks. I just wanted to thank him properly." John said, "He wouldn't accept anything from me yesterday." She nodded and stepped aside. "He's out back working on the fence. You're welcome to wait." John stepped inside and took in the modest surroundings. The furniture was old but clean, and the walls were adorned with family photos and hand-drawn pictures. Likely from a younger Samuel. It was a far cry from John's sleek, modern house, yet it felt warm, alive. In the backyard, Samuel was repairing a fence, his hands moving with the same quiet confidence John had noticed the day before. The boy looked up, surprised to see him. "Hey, mister," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" John smiled, feeling a little awkward. "I wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I really needed it, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Samuel shrugged, his expression easy and genuine. "It wasn't a big deal. But it was to me." John said, "People don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return." Samuel tilted his head, puzzled. "Why wouldn't you help if someone needed it?" "That's just how I see it." John was struck by the simplicity of the boy's logic. He glanced around the yard, noting the patched fence, the uneven grass, and the old swing set with rusted chains. It was clear the family didn't have much, yet they made do. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," John said. "Your mother must be proud." Samuel grinned, glancing back toward the house. "She works hard. I just try to help out where I can." John fell silent for a moment, reflecting on his own childhood in a modest home. His parents had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, teaching him the value of hard work and integrity. Somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with those lessons, consumed by the pursuit of success. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," John said at last. Samuel straightened, his expression cautious. "We're okay, mister. We don't need anything." "It's not about need," John insisted. "It's about doing what's right. You helped me, and I'd like to return the favor." Before Samuel could respond, his mother called from the porch, inviting him inside for lunch. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, and the mismatched chairs around the table were worn but sturdy. As they ate, Samuel talked about school and his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother spoke with quiet pride about the close-knit community that looked out for one another. John listened intently, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For all his wealth and success, his own home felt cold and empty compared to this modest house filled with laughter and connection. As John drove away later that afternoon, he knew he wouldn't be able to walk away without doing something to honor the kindness and integrity this family had shown him. James Caldwell, a retired executive in his mid-60s, stood in the modest backyard of a weathered home, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and regret. The boy standing before him, Elijah, had done something James couldn't shake. He had offered kindness without expecting anything in return. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," James said at last, his voice steady. Elijah, a thoughtful and resourceful 14-year-old, straightened his posture, his expression cautious. "We're okay, Mr. Caldwell. We don't need anything." James shook his head. "It's not about need. It's about doing what's right. You helped me when I was stuck, and I'd like to return the favor." Before Elijah could respond, his mother stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her warm smile and tired eyes spoke of years of hard work. "Elijah, come inside and wash up for lunch," she called. Then, noticing James, she added, "You're welcome to join us. It's nothing fancy, but we'd be glad to have you." James hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to such open invitations, but the sincerity in her voice left him no room for excuses. "I'd like that," he said, following her inside. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables. The table, though small and surrounded by mismatched chairs, was set with care. James sat down, feeling strangely out of place in his tailored slacks and pressed shirt amidst the humble surroundings. Elijah washed his hands at the sink and joined them, his easy smile never faltering. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Elijah talked about his school, his love for tinkering with machines, and his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother, proud and composed, shared stories about their close-knit community and the challenges they had faced over the years. James listened intently, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. His sprawling mansion and luxury cars suddenly felt hollow compared to the laughter and connection filling this modest home. After lunch, as they cleared the table, James turned to Elijah's mother. "You've done an incredible job raising him," he said, his voice earnest. "He's got more heart than most people I know." Her eyes glistened as she smiled. "Thank you. He's a good boy. Life hasn't been easy for us, but we've learned to appreciate the small things." James nodded, his mind already turning over ideas. He didn't want to overstep, but he couldn't leave without doing something for them. This family had reminded him of values he had long forgotten: kindness, resilience, and integrity. When James left their home that afternoon, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. On the drive back to his estate, a plan began to take shape. This wasn't about charity, it was about honoring their selflessness. The next morning, James got to work. He made calls to contractors, suppliers, and colleagues, using his connections to set a plan in motion. Within a week, trucks and workers began arriving at Elijah's home. Standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, James directed the renovations as Elijah and his mother watched in shock. "You didn't have to do this," Elijah's mother said, her voice trembling as she saw supplies being unloaded. "We've managed just fine on our own." James turned to her, his expression resolute. "You've done more than manage, you've thrived. But you gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "Let me give back." Elijah, quieter than usual, stood next to his mother, his brow furrowed in thought. James knelt slightly to meet his eye. "You taught me something, Elijah," he said gently. "Helping people isn't about money, it's about showing up. I want to show up for you." Over the following weeks, the house underwent a complete transformation. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy wood, the leaky roof repaired, and the rusty swing set in the backyard was replaced with a new one. Inside, the walls were painted, the floors polished, and the kitchen was upgraded with modern appliances. Elijah often tried to help with the renovations, carrying planks or sweeping debris, but James insisted he take a break. "Your job," James said with a smile, "is to enjoy being a kid for a little while." Still, Elijah couldn't resist sneaking out to watch the crew work. His curiosity was obvious, his eyes lighting up as he observed them measure, cut, and build. One of the workers, a burly man named Joe, noticed and invited Elijah to help measure wood planks. Before long, Elijah was asking questions about tools and construction. His excitement infectious. James watched from a distance, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, something beyond himself. As the renovations neared completion, Elijah's mother stood on the newly built porch, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just a house anymore, it's a home. I don't know how we can ever thank you." James shook his head. "You already have. You reminded me what life is supposed to be about: family, connection, and purpose. I think I'm the one who should be thanking you." On the final day, neighbors stopped by to see the transformation, bringing small gifts, fresh bread, jars of jam, and even potted plants. Elijah's laughter echoed through the yard as he showed his friends the swing set and freshly painted rooms. As the sun set, James stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of joy, simple, unfiltered joy. Looking at Elijah and his mother, James knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, a newfound purpose, a lasting connection, and a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. James Caldwell stood on the edge of the yard, watching the transformation unfold. The boy, Caleb, worked with uncontainable excitement, his eyes lighting up as he observed the workers measuring, cutting, and assembling. Caleb's endless curiosity had won over the crew, and a burly man named Joe had taken the boy under his wing, showing him how to measure planks and discussing the basics of construction. For James, it was more than just a home renovation, it was a renewal of something deep within him. For the first time in years, James felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that reached beyond himself. Caleb's energy and ambition reminded James of the man he used to be, back before his life became a blur of boardrooms, mergers, and endless obligations. As the sun began to set, casting the yard in a warm golden light, the project neared its end. Caleb, his mother Mia, and James stood on the newly repaired porch, taking in the changes. The sagging roof and cracked steps were gone, replaced with sturdy wood and a fresh coat of paint. The once rusty swing set in the backyard had been swapped for a brand new one, its chains gleaming in the sunlight. Mia turned to James, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just a house anymore, Mr. Caldwell. It's a home. I don't know how we can ever thank you." James shook his head, his tone soft but firm. "You already have. You reminded me of what life is supposed to be about: family, connection, and purpose. Honestly, I think I'm the one who should be thanking you." The final day of the project felt like a celebration. Neighbors stopped by to see the changes, bringing small gifts, freshly baked bread, jars of homemade preserves, and even a potted plant. Caleb's laughter filled the yard as he showed his friends the new swing set and the freshly painted rooms inside the house. James stood on the porch, leaning against the sturdy new railing, watching the joyful scene unfold. It had been years since he felt this kind of pure, unfiltered happiness. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from closing a big deal or buying something expensive. This was different. This was real. Mia walked over to James, a glass of iced tea in her hand. She offered it to him with a smile. "You've done more than fix a house," she said softly. "You've given us hope, and I think maybe you found something for yourself too." James nodded, taking a sip of the tea. "I have," he admitted. "I spent so many years chasing things I thought mattered: money, status, influence, but none of it feels like this. None of it ever filled me the way this has." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb joined him on the porch, his boundless energy still intact. He looked up at James, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Caldwell," Caleb began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for us. I want to do something like that one day. I want to help people too." James placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "You already are, Caleb. Your kindness set all of this in motion. Don't ever lose that." The three of them sat together, watching the sky shift from gold to deep orange. The warmth of the day lingered. But it wasn't just the weather, it was the connection, the gratitude, and the shared sense of purpose that filled the moment. When it was time for James to leave, Caleb and Mia walked him to his car. Caleb's wide grin and Mia's tearful smile were etched into James's memory as he drove away. He realized then that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. The weeks that followed brought even more change. Caleb's newfound curiosity about construction blossomed into a genuine passion. James arranged for Caleb to shadow the workers who had helped with the renovations. And the boy eagerly soaked up every bit of knowledge. James, in turn, found himself returning to their small town again and again. Each visit felt less like a trip and more like coming home. He no longer felt like an outsider in Caleb and Mia's lives. He was part of something bigger now. The story ended where it had begun, in a small town with a big heart. One act of kindness from a young boy reminded an older man of life's greatest lesson: it's not about what you have but what you give.